Good day everyone, I am Jala Francisco Abrica and today we will discuss about the ethical and social considerations in testing that involves five topics. First, we have the ethical issues, the confidentiality, the protection of privacy, the communicating test results, and lastly, we have the qualification of professional competence. But particularly, I will be discussing about the ethical issues that involves the concerns and issues of the public. Also, we have the responsibilities of the test user and the concerns and issues. Also, we have the rights of the test taker and its concerns and issues. And lastly, we have the special issues. So at the end of our learning discussion, we will be able to identify unethical situations and events in the field of testing. And also we'll be able to synthesize how to improve their competence in testing guided with the professional's ethics. Almost every one of us has heard the horrific anecdotes about testing and assessment. For example, isang minority grade schooler na labeled as mentally retarded on the basis of a single IQ score. So the dilemmas of psychological testing do not always have simple, obvious answers. So even thoughtful and experienced mga psychologists may disagree as to what is ethical or professional in a given instance. So nonetheless, the scope of ethical and professional practice is not a matter of individual taste or personal judgment. Yung mga responsible test use is defined by written guidelines published by professional associations katulad ng American Psychological Association, American Counseling Association, National Association of School Psychologists, and many more. So whether they know it or not, all practitioners owe allegiance to these guidelines. A body of ethics is a body of principles of right, proper, or good conduct. The ethics of testing and assessment is guided by the profession's ethics. First, we have here the public, its concerns and issues. So first, let us briefly discuss the history of issues and concerns of the public. So noong World War I, professionals and non-professionals adapted group tests developed ng mga military para sa civilian use sa schools at sa industry. So reflecting growing public discomfort about this assessment industry were popular magazine articles na nag-feature ng mga stories such as with titles such as The Abuse of Tests. So noong World War II naman, pinasa ng Kongreso yung National Defense Education Act na nag-provide ng federal money sa local schools para sa purpose ng testing ability and aptitude to identify gifted and academically talented students. So also, on World War II, na-renew na naman yung public concern. And it was reflected in magazine articles which were entitled such as Testing, Can Everyone Be Pigeonholed? At yung what the tests do not test. At noong 1969 naman, there is a widespread media attention na binigay sa publication ng article ng Harvard Educational Review na merong title na How Much Can We Boost IQ and Scholastic Achievement? So the extent of public concern about psychological assessment is reflected in the extensive involvement of the government in many aspects of the assessment process in recent decades. So first, we have legislation. First, we have the minimum competency testing programs. Noong 1970s, numerous states enacted minimum competency testing programs. So, yung mga formal testing programs designed na para gamitin sa decision regarding sa various aspects ng students' education. And these laws support for the idea na ang isang high school graduate should have at the very least minimal competencies in areas such as in reading, writing, and arithmetic. So, yung truth in testing legislation naman na pinasa state level noong 1980, the primary objective of these laws was to give test takers a way to learn the criteria by which they are being judged. So, yung ibang laws, nag-mandate ng disclosure ng answers sa post-secondary and professional school admission tests within 30 days. Yung iba naman, nag-require ng information na relevant sa isang test development and technical soundness to be kept on file. At yung ibang law naman nag-mandate ng involvement ng executive branches ng government sa kanilang application. We also have the demand for proportionality. So public has been quick to label a test as unfair and discriminatory regardless of its utility. So as a consequence, a great public demand for proportionality by group members in hiring and college admissions now coexist with a great lack of proportionality in skills across groups. So next, under the concerns and issues of the public, we have the litigation. So litigation, ito yung mga court-mediated resolutions of legal matters of a civil, criminal, or administrative nature. So rules governing citizens' behaviors stem not only from legislatures, but also from interpretations of existing law in the form of decisions handed down by courts. For example, the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children brought suit because children with intellectual disability in that state had been denied access to public education. So in Mills naman, a similar lawsuit was filed on behalf of children with behavioral, emotional, and learning impairments. So taking together these two cases, it had the effect of jump-starting similar litigation in several other jurisdictions and alerting Congress to the need for federal law to ensure appropriate educational opportunities para sa mga children with disabilities. Next, we have the test user, its responsibilities, the concerns, and the issues. So first, we have the test user's competence and responsibility. So ethical standards for the distribution of psychological tests and diagnostic aids define three levels of test in terms of the degree to which the test user or the test use required knowledge of the testing and psychology. So we have here level A, level B, and level C. So sa level A, ito yung mga test or aids na can be adequately administered. Yung level B naman, ito yung mga tests or aids na nag-require ng some technical knowledge. At yung level C naman, ito yung mga tests and aids na nag-require talaga ng substantial understanding. So in general, test publishers try to screen out yung mga inappropriate requests by requiring that purchasers have the necessary credentials. For example, yung Psychological Corporation, one of the major suppliers of test materials in the United States, requires prospective customers to fill out a registration form. So, on a related note, ethical standards now discourage practitioners from giving take-home tests to clients. So, even though publishers attempt to filter out yung mga unqualified purchasers, there may still be instances in which sensitive tests are sold to yung mga unscrupulous individuals. So, Oates and Davis discovered that graduate students in psychology could purchase the MMPI, the TAT, the Stanford Binet, and the 16PF if they type their orders on college stationery, place the letters PhD after their names, enclosed payments, and use the post office box return address. So, although illicit test orders are few in number, they do occur. Next, tests should only be used by qualified persons. So, professional standards promulgated by the professional organizations state that psychological tests should be used only by yung mga qualified persons. So, the obligations of professionals to test takers are set forth in a document called the Code of Fair Testing Practices in Education. So, yung document na ito, nag-present siya ng standards sa educational test developers in 4 areas. Areas first, developing and selecting tests. Next, the interpretation of scores. Third, striving for fairness. And lastly, informing test takers. So, reasons for restricted access include the potential for harm if tests fall into the wrong hands, and that many tests are no longer valid if potential examinees have previewed them. So, according to the standards for educational and psychological testing, Standard 9.1 says that responsibility for test use should be assumed by or delegated only sa mga individuals na merong training, professional credentials, and experiences necessary to handle this responsibility. All special qualifications para sa test administration or interpretation na specified sa test manual should be met. According naman sa ethical principles of the American Psychological Association, psychologists retain appropriate responsibility for the appropriate application, interpretation, and use of assessment instruments, whether they score and interpret such tests themselves or they use automated or other services. So speaking of automated services, next online we have the computerized test administration, scoring, and interpretation. So computer-assisted psychological assessment of the CAPA has become more the norm than the exception. So an ever-growing number of psychological tests can be purchased on disk or administered and scored online. In many respects, the relative simplicity, convenience, and range of potential testing activities that computer technology brings to the testing industry have been a great boon. So some major issues with regards to CAPA are as follows. First, we have the access to test administration, the scoring, and the interpretation software. So, computer-administered test may still be copied and duplicated despite ng mga technological safeguards. Next, we have the comparability of pencil and paper sa computerized versions of test. There is insufficient research between sa comparability between these two, the computer-administered at yung mga pencil and paper format na mga tests. Next, we have the value of computerized test interpretations. So, thousands of words are spewed out every day and the form of test interpretation results, but the value of these words in many cases is questionable. Lastly, unprofessional, unregulated psychological testing online. So, vast majority of the tests offered online will not meet a psychologist's standard. So, according to the standards for educational and psychological testing, according to its standard 9.10, 9.22, and standard 9.23. So first, we have the standard 9.10. So test users should not rely solely sa computer-generated interpretations ng mga test results. And standard 9.22 and standard 9.23 talks about the responsibility of the test user to respect test copyrights.
Now we are down to the letter C, the rights of the test takers and the concerns and issues. So first we have here informed consent. So the test taker has the right to informed consent. So consent must be in written rather than oral form. And informed consent implies that the test taker's representatives are made aware in language that they can understand of the reasons for testing, the type of tests to be used, the intended use, and the range of material consequences of the intended use. So if written, video or audio records are made of the testing session or other records are kept, test takers are entitled to know what testing information will be released and to whom. So under its concerns and issues, first we have the legally mandated. So when testing is legally mandated, as in a court-ordered situation, obtaining informed consent to test may be considered more of a courtesy than a necessity. So next, when it is advisable not to obtain fully informed consent to evaluation, professional discretion is in order. So test takers might be given a minimum amount of information before that testing. Next, we have the deception. So the EPA ethical principles of psychologists and code of conduct provides that psychologists first do not use deception unless it is absolutely necessary. Second, do not use deception at all if it will cause participants emotional distress. And lastly, fully debrief participants. Next, we have exceptions to confidentiality. So we can breach confidentiality if the person has the potential to harm himself or herself or the people around him or her. And also, if the information that has been requested is based on asam buena. And lastly, we have here the participants might feel pressure. So another issue is that during personal evaluations, participants might feel pressured to reveal personal information on tests because they aspire to a certain position. From a legal standpoint, the three elements of informed consent include disclosure, competency, and voluntariness. So in cases where the examinee is a child, elderly, or has mental disability, a guardian will need to provide legal consent. According to the Standard 8.1, information about test content and purposes that is available to any test taker prior to testing should be available to all test takers. Shared information should be available free of charge and in accessible format. And also, we have here the Standard 8.4, which talks about obtaining informed consent except first, when testing without consent is mandated by law or government regulation. Second, when testing is conducted as a regular part of school activities. And lastly, when consent is clearly implied, such as in employment settings. Next, after the informed consent, we have the responsible report writing and communication of test results. So dati, many psychological assessors tell test takers as little as possible, but all that has changed. So today, giving realistic information about test performance to examinees is not only ethically and legally mandated, but may be useful from a therapeutic perspective as well. So under it, first we have the responsible report writing. So effective report writing is an important skill because of the potential lasting impact of the written document. Typically, it uses simple and direct writing. Next, we have the voided results. So if the test results, findings, or recommendations made on the basis of test data are voided for any reason, test takers have a right to know that as well. So the test user will inform the test taker of the purpose of the test, the meaning of the score relative to those of other test takers, and the possible limitations and margins of error of the test. So according to Standard 5.9, when test score information is released to students, parents, legal representatives, teachers, clients, or the media, those responsible for testing program should provide appropriate interpretations. Next, we have the further questions. So regardless of whether such reporting is done in person or in writing, a qualified professional should be available to answer any further questions that test takers have about the test score. So ideally, counseling resources will be available for those who react adversely to the information presented. Next, we have the providing effective and constructive feedback. So it involves give and take dialogue in which the clinician ascertains how the client has perceived the information and seeks to correct potential harmful interpretations. Next online, we have the least stigmatizing label. So the standards advise na least stigmatizing labels should always be assigned when reporting test results. So because labels may affect one's access to help. And according to Standard 8.7 of the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, when score reporting assigns scores of individual test takers into categories, the labels assigned to the categories should be chosen to reflect intended inferences and should be described precisely. Next online, we have the privacy, confidentiality, and duty to warn. So privacy right recognizes the freedom of the individual to pick and choose for himself the time, the circumstances, and particularly the extent to which he wishes to share or withhold from others his attitudes, beliefs, behavior, and opinions. So next, we have the disclosure of information. The competent client can direct the psychologist to disclose information to some third party, and the psychologist is obligated to make the disclosure. So in some rare instances, the psychologist may be ethically, if not legally, compelled to disclose information if that information will prevent harm either to the client or to some endangered third party. So the Ethical Code of the American Psychological Association specifically states that information derived by a psychologist from any source can be released only with the permission of the client. Next, you have the invasion of privacy. So usually it becomes most controversial with personality tests. Persons may unknowingly reveal characteristics about themselves that they would rather keep private. And Dahlstrom, 1969, argued that public concern over the invasion of privacy is based on two basic issues. First, tests have been oversold to the public with a resulting exaggeration of their scope and accuracy. Second misconception is that it is not necessarily wrong to obtain information about persons that they either are unaware of themselves or would rather keep private. So the more important issue is how the information is used. Next, we have the duty to warn. So psychologists also have a duty to warn that stems from the 1976 decision in the Tarasov case. So Tanya Tarasov was a young college student in California who was murdered by Podar. What makes the case relevant to the practice of psychology is that Podar had made death threats regarding Tarasov to his campus-based therapist. So although the therapist warned the police that Podar had made death threats, he did not warn Tarasov. 2 months later, Podar stabbed Tarasov to death at her home. So the parents of Tanya Tarasov sued, and the California Supreme Court later agreed that therapists have a duty to use reasonable care to protect potential victims from their clients. So although the Tarasov ruling has been modified by legislation in many states, the thrust of the case still stands. Clinicians must communicate any serious threat to the potential victim, law enforcement agencies, or both. So, let's look at the standards for educational and psychological testing. So according to Standard 8.5, policies for the release of test scores with identifying information should be carefully considered and clearly communicated to those who have access to the scores. According naman sa Standard 8.6, test data maintained or transmitted in data files should be adequately protected from improper access, use, or disclosure. Next, letter D, consideration of individual differences. So, the American Psychological Association lists this as one of the 6 guiding principles which can be found in Principle D, the respect for people's rights and dignity, that says psychologists are aware of cultural, individual, and role differences, including those due to age, gender, race, ethnicity, national region, religion, sexual orientation, disability, language, and socio-economic status. Psychologists try to eliminate the effect on their work of biases based on those factors, and they do not knowingly participate in or condone unfair discriminatory practices. And under it, we have here testing people with disabilities. So to test people with disabilities, needs transformation of tests, and transformation of tests depends on the nature of the disability. So challenges in this area may include transforming the test into a form that can be taken by the test taker. Second, transforming the responses of the test taker so that they are scorable. And third, meaningfully interpreting the test data. Next, we have the quickening the process of dying. So in Oregon, they have the ODA or the ODDA or the Oregon's Death with Dignity Act. So the Oregon is the first state to enact death with dignity legislation. So it is a request for assistance in dying that may be granted only contingent on the findings of a psychological evaluation. So life or death literally hangs in the balance of such assessments. Next, we have the impact of cultural background on test results. For this reason, Sattler 1988 advises assessment psychologists to approach their task for a pluralistic standpoint. Cultural groups may vary with respect to cultural values, stemming in part from cultural shock, discontinuity, or conflict. Also, language and nuances in language style, views of life and death, roles of family members, problem-solving strategies, attitudes toward education, mental health and mental illness, and stage of acculturation. So you should adapt a frame of reference that will enable you to understand how particular behaviors make sense within each culture. So some studies are made regarding on the impact of cultural background on test results, and some essential lessons from studies is that culturally based differences in response style may function to conceal the underlying competence of some examinees. So cautious interpretation of test results is always advisable, but this is especially important for examinees from culturally or linguistically diverse backgrounds. So also, APA published its guidelines for psychological practice with transgender and gender non-conforming people, or the TGNC, and this document lists and discusses 16 guidelines. Next, we have the language barriers. So psychologists using the service of an interpreter must assure themselves of the adequacy of the interpreter's training, obtain the informed consent of the client to use that particular interpreter, and ensure that the interpreter will respect the confidentiality of test results and test security. In addition, any limitations on the data obtained via the use of an interpreter must be discussed in presenting the results of the evaluation. And also, we have here the other groups. So other groups have their own best practices or simply practices that may inform professional practice. Lastly, we have the letter D, the special issues. First, you have the testing industry. So the spread of consumerism in America has seen increasing criticism of the testing industry. Most of the ethical criticism leveled at the larger companies fall into the categories of marketing, sales to unauthorized users, and the problem of the so-called impersonal services. Publishers claim that they do make good faith efforts to police sales so that only qualified users obtain tests. They note that they cannot control the behavior of individuals in institutions where tests are sent. Next, we have the premature release of a test. So testing is a noble enterprise, but it is also a big business driven by the profit motive, which provides an inherent pressure toward early release of new or revised materials. So perhaps that is why the American Psychological Association and other organizations have published standards that relate to test publication. So these standards pertain especially to the technical manuals and user guides that typically accompany a test. So manuals and guides will report detailed statistics on reliability analysis, validity studies, normative samples, and other technical aspects. So in particular, test authors should strive for a balanced presentation of their instruments and refrain from a one-sided presentation of information. Next, we have the high-stakes testing. So the term high-stakes tests refers to cognitively loaded instruments designed to assess knowledge, skill, and ability with the intent of making employment, academic, graduation, or licensing decisions. For a number of public policy and political reasons, these testing programs face considerable scrutiny and criticism. Such testing includes the SAT, the GRE, and state examinations that establish graduation requirements and professional or job entry examinations. So we have here the issues and concerns of cheating. So widespread cheating in public school systems is sporadically reported in many large cities across the United States. So in most cases, the cheating is motivated by the desire of teachers and principals to further their own careers by creating the illusion of educational excellence. For example, in 1999, dozens of teachers and 2 principals in the New York City public school system were charged with helping students cheat on the standardized reading and math tests used to rank schools and determine whether students move on to the next grade. Next, we have the subject to misuse and a degree of tyranny. So individuals' rights and welfare are easily lost in the face of corporate advantage and political struggles about accountability in education. However, When test results are used inappropriately, they can have highly damaging unintended consequences. High-stakes decisions, such as high school graduation or college admissions, should not be made on the basis of a single set of test scores that only provide a snapshot of student achievement. Such scores may not accurately reflect a student's progress and achievement, and they do not provide much insight into other critical components of future success, such as motivation and character. What students are taught is dictated by parents and teachers, and they responded to the high-stakes test by strongly supporting teaching that would yield better results. And lastly, we have the teaching psychological testing. Psychologists who are responsible for education and training programs take reasonable steps to ensure that the program are designed to provide appropriate knowledge and proper experiences to meet the requirements for licensure, certification, and other goals for which claims are made by the program. So under here, we have the use of children and students, classmates as practice subjects in psychological testing courses. So in this type of course, students experience firsthand how ethical problems are identified, addressed, and resolved. So they note that the instructor's demonstration of how the ethical principles is highlighted and explored can enable students to internalize a model for addressing such dilemmas in the future. So there are 4 particular concerns that are described in this situation. So first, we have the student's role in procuring personal experience with personality testing. Second, identification of participants with which to practice. Third, the development of informed consent procedures for assessment participants. And lastly, classroom presentations. Next, we have the potentials for violations of privacy. So in other teaching contexts, the potential for violations of privacy is significant in situations in which graduate students are required to make personality tests for practice. So Yalof and Brabender, 2001, address ethical dilemmas in personality assessment courses with respect to using the classroom for in vivo training. So they argue that the students' introduction to ethical decision making and personality assessment occurs in assessment courses with practice components. Today, we can hear criticisms of the public based on misunderstanding of testing that may result in fear, anger, legislation, litigation, and administrative regulations. Also, let us take note that test users should have the competency and sense of responsibility in choosing, in administering, and in interpreting tests. There are also major issues in regards to computer-administered tests. Test takers have the right of informed consent, informed of the test findings, privacy and confidentiality. So individual differences should also be respected. And lastly, special issues in testing and assessment includes the testing industry, high-stakes testing, and teaching psychological testing. Thank you for listening, and God bless us all.